mosquito, so called from its stinging sarcasms. Now and then another with a new title appears, like a shooting star, but, from want of support or from some other motive, is suddenly extinguished. Enlightened individuals like Don Lucas Alaman and Count Cortina have published newspapers, but not for any length of time. Count Cortina especially edited a very witty and brilliant paper called the Zuraigo, the Scourge, and another called the Mono, the Ape, and in many of his articles he was tolerably severe upon the incorrect Spanish of his brother editors, of which no one can be a better judge, he having been a member of the Academia de la Lengua in Spain. The only kind of monthly reviews in Mexico is the Mosaico Mexicano, whose editor has made his fortune by his own activity and exertions. Frequently it contains more translations than original matter, but from time to time it publishes scientific articles said to be written by Don J. M. Bustamante, which are very valuable, and occasionally a brilliant article from the pen of Count Cortina. General Orbegoso, who is of Spanish origin, is also a contributor. Sometimes, though rarely, it publishes documentos inéditos, unedited documents, connected with Mexican antiquities and Mexican natural history and biography, which are very important, and now and then it contains a little poetical gem, I know not whether original or not, but exceedingly beautiful. So far as it goes, this review is one great means of spreading knowledge, at least amongst the better classes, but I understand that the editor, Don Ignacio Compledo, a very courteous, intelligent man, complains that it does not pay. There are no circulating libraries in Mexico. Books are at least double the price that they are in Europe. There is no diffusion of useful knowledge amongst the people, neither cheap pamphlets nor cheap magazines written for their amusement or instruction; but this is less owing to want of attention to their interests on the part of many good and enlightened men, than to the unsettled state of the country, for the blight of civil war prevents the best systems from ripening. Fortunately there is an English society here, a kind of book club, who, with their minister, have united in a subscription to order from England all the new publications. And as C n is a member of this society, we are not so arriérés in regard to the literature of the day as might be supposed. Like all English societies, its basis is a good dinner, which each member gives in turn, once a month, after which there is a sale of the books that have been read, and propositions for new books are given in to the president. It is an excellent plan, and I believe is in part adopted by the other foreigners here. But Germans of a certain class do not seem to be sufficiently numerous for such an undertaking, and the French in Mexico, barring some distinguished exceptions, are apt to be amongst the very worst specimens of that people which "le plaisant pays de France" can furnish forth. We went lately to a ball given by a young Englishman, which was very pretty, and where nearly all the English were collected. Of families there are not more than half a dozen resident here, the members of whom form a striking contrast in complexion to the Mexicanas. With very few exceptions, and these in the case of English women married to foreigners, they keep themselves entirely aloof from the Mexicans, live quietly in their own houses, into which they have transplanted as much English comfort as possible, rarely travel, and naturally find Mexico the dullest of cities. C n has gone to dine with the English Minister, and I am left alone in this large room with nothing but a humming bird to keep me company, the last of my half dozen. It looks like a large blue fly, and is perfectly tame, but will not live many days. I was startled by a solemn voice saying, "Ave María Purissima," and looking up, there stood in the doorway a friar of orders gray, bringing some message to C n from the head of the convent of San Fernando, with which monks C n has formed a great intimacy, chiefly in consequence of the interest which he has taken in the history of their missions to California. In fact, when we hear the universal cry that is raised against these communities for the inutility of their lives, it is but just that exceptions should be made in favour of those orders who, like the monks of San Fernando, have dispersed their missionaries over some of the most miserable parts of the globe, and who, undeterred by danger and by the prospect of death, have carried light to the most benighted savages. These institutions are of a very remote date. A learned Jesuit monk, Eusebio Kun, is said to have been the first who discovered that California was a peninsula. In 1683 the Jesuits had formed establishments in Old California, and for the first time it was made known that the country which had until then been considered an El Dorado, rich in all precious metals and diamonds, was arid, stony, and without water or earth fit for vegetation; that where there is a spring of water it is to be found amongst the bare rocks, and where there is earth there is no water. A few spots were found by these industrious men, uniting these advantages, and there they founded their first missions. But the general hatred with which the Jesuits were regarded excited suspicion against them, and it was generally supposed that their accounts were false, and that they were privately becoming possessed of much treasure. A visitador surveyor was sent to examine into the truth, and though he could discover no traces of gold or silver, he was astonished by the industry and zeal with which they had cultivated the barren and treeless waste. In a few years they had built 16 villages, and when they were expelled in 1767, the Dominican friars of Mexico took their place. Until these missions were established, and in every part of the peninsula which is not included in the territory of the missions, the savages were the most degraded specimens of humanity existing. More degraded than the beasts of the field, they lay all day upon their faces on the arid sand, basking in the heat. They abhorred all species of clothing, and their only religion was a secret horror that caused them to tremble at the idea of three divinities, belonging to three different tribes, and which divinities were themselves supposed to feel a mortal hatred, and to wage perpetual war against each other. Undeterred by the miserable condition both of human and of vegetable nature, these missionaries cultivated the ground, established colonies, made important astronomical observations, and devoted themselves to science, to agriculture, and to the amelioration of the condition of these wretched savages. In New California the missions were under the charge of 36 Franciscan friars, under whom the most extraordinary progress in civilization took place, since in little more than 30 years upwards of 33,000 Indians were baptized, and 8,000 marriages had taken place. The soil being fertile and the climate more benign than in the other California, in 18 missions established there, they cultivated corn, wheat, maize, etc., and introduced vegetables and fruit trees from Spain, amongst these the vine and the olive, from which excellent wine and oil were made all through that part of the country. Amongst the monks destined to these distant missions were those of San Fernando. There, banished from the world, deprived of all the advantages of civilization, they devoted themselves to the task of taming the wild Indians, introduced marriage amongst them, taught them to cultivate the ground, together with some of the most simple arts, assisted their wants, reproved their sins, and transplanted the beneficent doctrines of Christianity amongst them, using no arms but the influence which religion and kindness, united with extreme patience, had over their stubborn natures, and making what Humboldt, in speaking of the Jesuit missions, calls a pacific conquest of the country. Many were the hardships which these poor men endured, changed from place to place, at one time ordered to some barren shore, where it was necessary to recompense their labours, at another recalled to the capital by orders of the prelate, in conjunction with the wishes of their brethren, among whom there was a species of congress called by them a capitulo. No increase of rank, no reward, no praise, inspired their labours; their only recompense was their intimate conviction of doing good to their fellow creatures. In the archives of the convent there still exist papers proving the hardships which these men underwent, the zeal with which they applied themselves to the study of the language of the country, and when we are informed that in the space of 180 leagues 19 different languages are spoken, it was no such easy task, and containing their descriptions of its physical and moral state, more or less well written according to their different degrees of instruction or talent. It frequently happened that marketable goods and even provisions had to be sent by sea to those missionaries who lived in the most savage and uncultivated parts of the peninsula, and a curious anecdote on this subject was related